Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War Frontline update for the 25th of July 2023. Let's get straight to the northeast. We're going to go to the Kupiansk, to Svatova, to Kreminna front line. On my map, that looks like this. If we zoom out to give you a sense of Ukraine as a whole, we have the Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Oblast front line down there in the south. We have the eastern front line going up past Bakhmut, and then we have the northeastern front line going from Kharkiv Oblast, a whole region there. This Kharkiv Oblast and Kupiansk, down to Svatova, which is just inside the Luhansk Oblast, as is Kreminna just to the south there. So that's where we're going first. I have 3 lines on my map. So every day people ask me what the lines mean, so I must make sure I do say what they are every day, and I'm sorry to repeat myself for those who watch these every day. So these are all referring to Russian defensive lines. So this is where the Russians are supposedly consolidated in their control. The red line is the line according to pro-Russian mapper Syriac Maps, a blue line pro-Ukrainian mapper Andrew Perpetua, and there will be some difference because of the way that they do their mapping and their sources that they use. Sometimes I think Syriac Maps is a little bit more generous to the Russians, and I think Andrew Perpetua is fairly objective actually. But it does depend. So when the Russians are on the attack, they're generally somewhat more reliable, the Syriac Maps with the Russian lines. But they've made mistakes, and we're going to talk about that soon. But it's useful because I think there are times when they are pretty reliable. And the white line is Deep State Map, the pro-Ukrainian mapper. And this is the line, the Russian defensive line as of the 30th of May. So we can see some comparison between then and now, before the counter-offensive started and now. There's activity in this forest area to the northeast of Kupiansk, and we've had Syriac Maps, pro-Russian mapper, rejigging again. They had overextended lines for the Russians here, which was one of their examples of being inaccurate. They didn't walk them back until recently when the Russian MOD started saying, we have just taken this railway station up here, which means that they weren't down here. So over the days, we've seen them walk it back, and walk it back, and they're still continuing to walk it back. It looks like a Ukrainian gain, but it's not a Ukrainian gain. It's just the Russians were never there. However, there are claims that the Russians have made it here just south of Liman Pershi. The claim from Syriac Maps is here that on the northeastern front, Russian army restarted offensive operations around south of Liman Pershi and began advancing towards the town of Sinkivka. So that is indication of activity there. If we come to the ISW, there is talk about activity up there. I'm not going to go through it all. But yeah, counterattacks. There are claims that Ukrainians are counterattacking west of Liman Pershi near the railway station we talked about. So that would be up here. So if the Ukrainians are counterattacking here, then there's something a bit weird going on because the Russians appear to be all over here. So that railway station is a blue roofed railway station there. And if the Ukrainians are attacking here, then I don't know quite what to make of that. However, claims are that the Russians have made some advances south of Liman Pershi. And then as we come further down this axis, we come towards the main area of discussion, which is around Adiivka. So again, there are some gains here as according to Syriac Maps. If we go to Syriac Maps and look at that, here is what they say. So the Ukrainian army withdrew from the village of Sahivka, the Russian army began combing operations there, while clashes between both sides continue at Novohorivka. There are claims that the Russians have Novohorivka. That is somewhat contested. So if we look to what the ISW do discuss all of this, but actually there's no point in reading through that because I'm basically telling you it. However, if we go to Rebar, the pro-Russian source, their account of what's going on, we'll start in Liman Pershi and come down to Kupiansk. In the Kupiansk sector, the Ukrainians conducted a series of counterattacks in an attempt to regain lost positions near Liman Pershi. So that could be that railway station. Russian troops repelled all attacks, forcing the enemy to retreat to their original lines. In the Svatova sector, the Ukrainians are attempting to advance in small groups against Russian positions west of Kupiansk. All enemy attempts to advance are successfully suppressed by concentrated artillery and small arms fire. That is to say that around here, the Ukrainians are trying to push back, according to Rebar, the pro-Russian source, but that there could be gains particularly in this area for the Russians. And Nova Horivka, there is an area that is contested, a little settlement there, and Sahivka. So there could be this idea that Sahivka is the Ukrainians are no longer there, that they've sort of got out of dodge, as according to Syriac maps here. And there is some gains actually that might need a bit of update. No, that is where it is. So there is they haven't moved the map, but they are pressuring towards Sahivka. Then we have the ISW, and I talked about this morning, saying there are claims that all these advances are being made by the Russians, but actually there's no visual evidence yet that they have succeeded in these gains. There are just different mill blogger claims regarding them. And it talks about how Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian forces expanded their foothold to the west of the Zherebets River, southwest of Svatova, and advanced up to 5 kilometers deep into Ukrainian lines, and that the Russian forces captured at least one Ukrainian fortified position near Adiivka, and that the Russian forces have conducted a failed ground attack towards Nadir, which is there. So perhaps the Ukrainians have stopped an advance in that area to the west of Ryorodka. Here we have the Zherebets River coming down here, and this is all to the west of the river. But anyway, something's going on there, and I would go with Andrew Perpetua. That is saying, look, he's probably looked at shelling and said, we can pretty much assume that the Russians control at least this much, which means there'll be grey zone further to the north, the west, and the south here, where there'll be fierce fighting, and then you'll have Ukrainian-controlled positions. So there is activity going on there. Just how much the Russians have succeeded will come out in the wash, I guess, over the next few days. But that is a continuing situation. There are claims from the Ukrainians that it has been stabilized, and that they are on top of it, if you like. So I guess we'll see. There's certainly far fewer advances, only a really small area there. Far fewer advances for the Russians in the last 24 hours than there were on the previous couple of days. So perhaps the Ukrainians have put an end to Russian advances there for now, but we shall see. Right, if we come further to the south, we come to Kreminna area, where geolocated footage published yesterday shows that Russian forces have made marginal gains. That's according to the ISW. This is referring to footage showing a T-90 tank burning up in a wood. So this is Russians getting a tank destroyed, but it means that they have a tank there. That's the kind of point. And that is a Russian tank here, which is kind of confirming, it could be validating both claims here, that the Russians are back behind Andrew Perpetua's line, and that they're attacking there. This is in the grey zone. That's where you would expect to see a burning tank, but it could also be behind Russian lines, as according to Syriac maps, and it's been hit with artillery behind their own lines. I mean, both of those mapping lines could be correct. There are claims from Syriac maps that the Russians advance down here, and advance indeed over here. They've had a number of advances in the forest area. It's not been confirmed by Andrew Perpetua, although there has been some fairly cloudy weather across Ukraine over the last few days, and that affects how Andrew Perpetua does his mapping, of course. But yeah, there's fierce fighting going on in Serebiansky Forest. That is for sure. Right, we come down now to Bakhmut, past Bilahorivka and Spirina, and again, no news about the north in Rozdilivka. Just don't know anything about stuff going on there. There are claims that the Ukrainians have advanced down the highway somewhat, so there could be some mapping changes to take place over the next 24 hours or so. There are claims that the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back to the back of Bakhmut. If that is true, that is really significant. There's been fierce fighting to and fro, ebbing and flowing here for the last week or so. And if the Ukrainians are now in Bakhmut pushing the Russians back to there, then that's massive. I don't know whether that's true, though. Right, let's go and have a look at a set of these claims. So The biggest news is to the south of Bakhmut, but we're going to go to the north first. So worrying stories coming from Russian channels, about northern Bakhmut. Ukrainians are attacking Bakhivka again, pushing the Russians to the rear of the settlement. So that's no reports is giving that. 30th Mechanized and 8th SSO entered Zalizhnyansky. So we heard recently that perhaps Zalizhnyansky was under a lot of pressure. There were claims that the Ukrainians had even come into Zalizhnyansky. All those claims are being made again today. It's not a huge settlement, as you can see, but it is important. It sits along this sort of small river, which acts as the front line connecting Vasyukivka to Zalizhnyansky. If the Russians lose Zalizhnyansky, then this tiny little bridgehead will be lost, and actually it might then be somewhat easier to push them back towards Blahodatny and down the grand line of communication coming into the north of Bakhmut and towards Krasnohorivka. So that would be important if the Ukrainians are indeed there. The 24th, 5th, and 22nd mechanized fighting are fighting, mechanized brigades are fighting northwest of Klishchivka. We'll come to that. And the 3rd Assault Brigade is attempting to advance towards Adiivka. And again, we'll come to that. Just in general about Bakhmut, Defmon talks about how there are VDV units in Bakhmut, and this could, due to the attritional nature of the fighting going on in Bakhmut, be really bad that the elite forces are being ground down in Bakhmut, and then that will affect their future offensive and defensive capabilities. There is talk about them being used kind of as pawns, that they've been moved there as kind of retribution for possibly refusing to fight in certain situations, and there's kind of arguments between Shoigu, Gerasimov, VDV, blah blah blah. So lots of talk to do with that, but the VDV they've got a whole suite of units active around Bakhmut, in and around Bakhmut bars, who are the reserves. So you've got like the DPR, LPR type forces and militia forces. You've got conventional forces. You've got VDV. You've got the Chechens. You did have Wagner, of course, and it's all quite a mishmash of forces there. Rebar, the pro-Russian force, says south of Bakhmut, the enemy managed to gain a foothold on the heights adjacent to Klishchivka at the cost of significant losses. So, of course, they've gained something, but they've lost loads, is the claim. It might have happened, but that's the kind of expectable rhetoric. At the moment, fierce fighting is taking place on the outskirts of the settlement. In the Kherson direction, we'll come to that much later, of course. So, fierce fighting on the outskirts, but that's all they say. The reality is there's quite a lot of activity going on in the south. Indeed, all the mappers suggest successes for the Ukrainians, including Deep State Map. So first, let's orient ourselves. So Zalizhnyansky coming down here. I haven't heard too much about stuff going on around Orikova, Vasilivka, and so on and so forth, but no doubt stuff is happening. Hidne fighting towards Bakhivka, as we've heard. The lines might be much further back. They might not be. Operational security, rumors, etc., etc. Fighting, indeed, north towards Bakhmut as well. It's just a very active front line. And then we come into this Klishchivka area. Right. It looks like a confusing map here. The white line is the pre-counteroffensive line. So you can see the advance, and then we have now 3 lines. So we've got the red line of Suryat maps, the blue line of Andrew Perpetua, and the yellow line of Deep State maps. And actually, the Deep State is a like-for-like comparison with the white line. So that is where Deep State have them, and they're supposed to be under a 48-hour or so operational security delay, but I don't think they are at the moment. They are starting to report, possibly because it's going well for the Ukrainians, they're starting to report more quickly at the moment around here. So they have all pretty much got agreement with Klishchivka, south of Klishchivka onto Andriivka. So we've got gains for all the mappers. We've got Deep State and Andrew Perpetua showing gains around Klishchivka, this area, and into Klishchivka in the south. So you've got the Russians being pushed back. In fact, Deep State map hasn't been pushed back the most in the southern area. The Suryat map still quite generous to the Russians south of Klishchivka and onto Andriivka. And then they are apparently fighting in and around Andriivka. We'll come on to that. The latest claim is that actually the Russians have pulled out from Andriivka. And then coming down south towards the canal, there are gains going south towards Kurdy and Mivka. So this whole area just here has suddenly been taken. Basically, the Ukrainians have made really good advances over the last 24 hours there, and then really starting to turn the screws on Klishchiivka, coming into Klishchiivka in the south, arguably in the north as well, according to some sources. So yeah, back to null reports. The Ukrainians, this was yesterday, reportedly take control over a large part of the height 197 south of Klishchiivka. So that is to the south here, um, some kind of height just to the south. If we come in, and I don't know if we can see the general sort of height difference, the terrain here in terms of physical geography. So if you see here, we've got Andriivka to the south. It's not, if we go north-south, it's a bit like that. Okay, so Andriivka to the south, Klishchiivka there. Then as we go in, you can see the ground is raised over here. That is coming into Klishchiivka. So that is fighting on the heights to the west of Klishchiivka, where there are all these entrenchments. You can just about see them there. These trenches that were built back in sort of before the war started, this part of the war started, previous iteration, but actually they've been extensively probably built onto, and that's what they've been fighting for a lot recently, and this forest line up the hill as well. So they're coming down into Klishchiivka, and they've been fighting for another height uh, on the way to Adiivka as well, but I don't know that we can really see that. It might be here. It's far less in terms of the raised ground to the west of Klishchiivka, but it's probably around here somewhere. So let's just now go back into uh, the top-down mode, and it'll be some. There's going to be some height around Andriivka that the Ukrainians have taken. That's according to null reports there. Height 197. So when fully controlled, Klishchiivka is cut off from Andriivka because the last height and defensive stronghold for the Russians was near the settlement. Klishchiivka is cut off from Andriivka, and Andriivka will be untenable, getting attacked from both the north and the west. So if these heights are under Ukrainian control, as it seems, they're now moving to the south of, goodness me, Google Earth, stop being silly. They are attacking, driving a wedge to the north of Andriivka, and that will allow them to flank Andriivka, as I say, from the north and the west. So getting up into there, and that also allows them to attack Kurdyivka from the south. So I think Klishchiivka from the south. Sorry, I've just confused myself so much. So Klishchiivka, I think, will be untenable over the next 24 hours plus, and I think Andriivka, well, there are claims that actually the Russians have just pulled out from there, and then that creates more difficulty for Kurdyivka to the south. So one affects the other, and they all start falling. Possibly, that's the hope anyway. Syriac Maps here says that Ukrainian army retook more hills and positions adjacent to the water channel and the small village of Andriivka. Moreover, troops managed to enter the town of Klishchiivka from the south. So that is again admission that they are in Klishchiivka for sure. Last night, Global War Monitor said Ukraine had added 1.5 square kilometers to the liberated status. I think that's more now. Entered Klishchiivka and advancing towards Andriivka. I think they're there. And then this morning, Ukrainian forces south of Bakhmut have almost entirely cleared the area west of Andriivka. Furthermore, Ukrainian controls the entire overlooking ridge of Klishchiivka, and by doing so has established effective fire control over the whole village. The Russian sources, as I reported this morning, are complaining from the field. They report that Klishchiivka, which is on the flank of Bakhmut, is on the verge of defeat and shameful surrender. It is possible to knock that out our infantry with the help of these same cluster munitions. So again, the importance of cluster munitions to this area and also to the south. Given the lack of reserves and rotation, the fall of Klishchiivka is only a matter of time. And then another Russian source saying, unfortunately, there are reports that Andriivka, south of Klishchiivka, has become a grey area. A very difficult battle is going on. It's known for sure that there are no enemy forces in the center. There on the outskirts, that is, of Andriivka here. Just here, the outskirts, only a very small settlement. But then the latest is that actually General Staff has said Russia retreats from Andriivka as Ukraine makes gains near Bakhmut. The Russian forces have retreated from their positions in Andriivka. The only way I can interpret that is they've pulled out of Andriivka to the south of Bakhmut. So that is the claim, that they have pulled out from Andriivka to the south of Bakhmut, to Opitny. There are a lot of forces lined. I think this road is kind of almost a defensive line for Russian forces as well. I think it might be on higher ground if I remember rightly. But yeah, so it's going well for the Ukrainians to the south of Bakhmut for sure. And then I reported what Bakhmut Demon said, which is that, yeah, near Andriivka, Russians were thrown back, basically saying it's pretty much carnage around there. The artillery is really doing a good job. And yeah, so it's not looking good for the Russians in the Bakhmut area. And when we come down on Institute for the Study of War, it's all pretty much the same. Nothing to add really from then. Ukrainian forces liberated 4 square kilometers in the Bakhmut direction in the past week. Well, I'd say that's arguably going to be doubled in the last 24 hours. So I think it's really good news if you're pro-Ukrainian, looking at what is going on in the Bakhmut area. Right, let's come out of there and pop to the south. We'll see how that goes today. I'm sure there's going to be lots of news coming out of particularly Andriivka and Klishivka area. Right, Avdiivka, usual fighting all around Avdiivka. Not too much really to report. The only thing is a claim from Global War Monitor, I think, that the Russians have gains around Krasnohorivka, which is between Marinka here in the south and Avdiivka here. There isn't too much to report in the ISW, just the normal place names being mentioned, repelled attacks, etc., etc. But as I say, Global War Monitor says that Russia has advanced further towards Krasnohorivka, just outside Donetsk. 1.4 square kilometers has been added to the occupied status. So that is up to, as according to Global War Monitor, up to the mine that they attacked and then pulled back from. Suryat map still has that under control of the Russians. I don't think that is true. I think they stormed it, they controlled it for a few hours, and then they were absolutely hammered by all sorts of munitions and sensibly pulled out of there. But it could be that they have nominal control of the fields and are setting up shop in those fields, maybe. But I wonder, when you start taking control of those fields, what do you do? Well, you want to build trenches. Well, how do you get your excavators in? It's very difficult building trenches when you're on the attack, right? And you're attacking into Ukrainian territory, and they're assuming there are no trenches there. So if you want to build trenches, then you're going to be doing that under artillery fire. Now, the Russians didn't have that problem. They were built huge, extensive trenches over 2 to 3 months, because they weren't necessarily being hit in those fields. It was a front line that was a potential front line for the future that we are seeing now. So I don't know whether there are already trenches in these areas that they're just going to fill. Nonetheless, we'll move on from the Avdiivka area past Novomykhailivka. Haven't heard anything about Vuhledar and Pavlivka and Mikilska. And so we'll come to the west along this southern Donetsk front line until we get to the border of Donetsk and Zaporizhia, that falls basically around Pryutny. And not a crazy amount of stuff coming out from here. We're hearing more about other places, other than there's just, fighting in Staromyrsky, of course, and this whole Velika Novosilka area. In the ISW, there are claims that Hanna Malia reported that Ukrainian troops had success in unspecified sectors along the Novodarivka, Pryutny, and Novosilivska Staromyrsky lines. So the claim here is that the Ukrainians have had success around here and around here, right? Novodarivka to Pryutny. So around this area, there was talk yesterday potential success around this kind of salient. They could have pushed the Russians back. Just operational security, don't know the details. I would assume that they are having some success there. There's talk about cluster munitions being, effectively used along this whole front line. Glasnost says Ukraine's made some modest gains in the south. Spokesperson of the General Staff said Ukrainian forces had success in the direction of Staromilsk and are entrenching themselves in the reached positions, adding Russian troops were resisting strongly. So there is strong resistance there, but there is potential success for the Ukrainians. That's the front line as I have it as well. Pretty much, well, you can see the Ukrainian control lines behind the Russian ones there. Small amounts of grey zone in some of these areas where it's just really intense fighting and less positional. Right, and then here is, I just found this a pretty fascinating map, and this is a map that we've seen anyway with War Mapper. So War Mapper's map, as you can see here, and going on, this is moving to Robert Turner, but I'm not going to talk about that yet. I just want to show you a map. Those are those little dots of bradyapherix mapping that shows the examples of where the Russians have built their trenches. Well, this one seems to add a bit more detail to that. So it says on a Velika Novosilka axis, the Ukrainians are still a way to go to get to the Surovikin line. So the trench lines, the red lines here, and you can really see that. So they are fighting in Staromilsk, which is going to be somewhere around here, and Urizhany. I presume this is, well, that's the river there coming down there, so they're going to be fighting around there, and Priyutne around here. But you can see the huge, extensive sort of trench networks, and they're going. This area, like I've said before, is one of the most heavily entrenched areas along the whole front line. So I'm just wondering why this is one of their primary points to attack, rather than, I don't know, just through here, like through some of these gaps. They're just absolutely trying to hammer through these really thick trench lines. Now, I'm sure they know far better than I do what they're doing, but it is interesting why they would go there. I mean, if we pull out onto my map, this is like some of the heaviest trench networks, and it's, and that's where they're attacking through. Anyway, there is activity there. Slight lack of detail there compared to other places. For example, we have some gains for the Ukrainians around Robotna, and this is quite significant because this is on the Surovikin line. So if we zoom into this part, we've just been up in Velika Novosilka area. We're now coming down past Drozhenka to Robotna. And here the Ukrainians have got over that initial first part of the Surovikin line there, the bigger trenches. They have control over some of those trenches and are now on the eastern side of Robotna. And I think that's some significant advancing there. The ISW talks about the Ukrainian forces continuing offensive operations in the area and advancing in the Orikhiv area. A Russian mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces advanced 1.7 kilometers towards the northeastern outskirts of Robotna, like we just seen. Another Russian mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces are regrouping near Robotna following an attempted attack there a couple of days ago. And Hanna Malia has reported that Ukrainian forces have conducted successful operations southeast of Orikhiv along the Novodanilivka to Verbove and Malotokmachka to the Verbove lines, and south of Kyiv along the Novodanilivka to Robotny line. Russian sources claim that the situation remains unchanged further to the west. I'll talk about that in a second. So they are making gains in this kind of area, going towards there from Malotokmachka down towards Verbove, and also down here towards Robotna. So both the mappers, we have Andrew Perpetua in blue and Suryat maps in red, are showing a pushback of the Russian forces. Again, it's slightly more charitable to the Russians when looking at the Suryat map lines in this particular area. Andrew Perpetua has them further back. He does a lot of shelling analysis, showing where the Ukrainians and all the Russians are shelling, and that shows you where the front lines are. There's some sort of difference over here. He was showing yesterday actually around this exact area. He had a satellite image of Novopokrovka, and he was like, I'm trying to do my geolocation, and this whole area is just covered in cloud. So yesterday's satellite imagery made it really difficult to work out where the movements are of the troops, and so that's why it's not always representative of what happened the last day. It depends on what the satellite imagery can tell you. But anyway, gains around Robotna, and that's really important. And especially since they are showing some movement across those initial large trench lines. And then when we come to the west, the claim that I read to you before was that it's unchanged around the Piatikhatki area, but there are some gains around Kamyansky. This is Andrew Perpetua's mapping, shows that the Russians have been pushed back south of Kamyanska and potentially, going to be flanked. Well, although it's difficult to be flanked because there's a river that separates them to the north. So really, actually, they're only being attacked, and then obviously the reservoir from the west, they're really only being attacked from the east, I guess. So they're not really being flanked, but they can't. They are backed in because they can't really run due to the river in several directions. So interesting what's going to happen perhaps with this southern part of Kamyanska there. But the Ukrainians have made some gains to the south towards Lhove, and there were some claims, there were some positive claims about this area, about moving towards Lhove as well yesterday. And some people are saying that actually, if they're to place bets, this would be one of the potentials for the most Ukrainian success. So towards Vasilivka, but I guess we'll wait to see. ISW, just says there's unchanged around Piatikhatki, and then goes on to talk about Kherson. Just to pop back into what the what Rebar, the pro-Russian source, says, in the Kherson direction, sabotage and reconnaissance groups had again attempted to land on Antonivsky Island. The Ukrainian landing forces, were promptly detected and destroyed by rocket artillery fire. That's their claim for what's going on in Kherson in the Antonivsky Bridge area. It's not really what anyone else is saying. Andrew Perpetua has the unchanged mapping situation, but there are many that are saying that actually the Russians have been pushed right back to Oleshki. We have no reports pretty much saying that here. To the front in Kherson, the Ukrainians are pushing eastwards towards Oleshki. So that is this area here where they have some sort of purchase there. Apparently, they've got control, as according to Andrew Perpetua's mapping, this little corner south of the Konka River. Well, they're pushing eastwards from there towards Oleshki, as according to no reports, and the Russians have actually retreated in multiple areas. Let's keep it with this. Much more is going on, but more on that later. So there is a lot going on here, but he's not saying much. He has firm Ukrainian control of that whole area to the north where the bridge starts. So this is this area here where Andrew Perpetua has Russian control of some of the dacha there. No reports. He has claims that the Ukrainians firmly control this area. The Russians have pulled right back, and they are, the Ukrainians are advancing on multiple axes there. So that's certainly something to look out for. In the ISW, Russian sources claim that Ukrainian forces continue attempts to land on the islands and establish positions on the left bank of the Dnipro. A prominent Russian mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian troops tried to land 3 small boats near Antonivsky Bridge and that Russian artillery strikes repelled the attempt. So that's your Rebar claim there. Other mill bloggers claim that Russian forces are constantly destroying small Ukrainian groups that are fighting for control of the islands in the Dnipro River Delta and on the east bank. Russian forces continue artillery strikes against the west bank. So it could be difficult. There could well be a loss of troops. When the Russians are sat back defensively, not needing to be risky in their kind of attacks, unless they're putting on counterattacks. But around here, I don't think there will be. It's all about the Ukrainian troops attacking and doing risky, landings, trying to get equipment across, getting troops across, reconnaissance, sabotage. But all the time, they'll be spotted by Russian drones, which is why electronic warfare is so important here. And this is why we've heard that it's the number one target in some places, and I'd imagine here big time, because you want to cut out the use of Russian drones so they can't spot to take out these small sabotage groups trying to get across the river. Anyway, that situation on the whole front line. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. I'm just about to do a live, goodness me, it's in half an hour, a live with Matthew Bishop, who now lives in Australia. He was living in Kharkiv. I'd love you to come and join us in half an hour's time, which will be when you're watching this, probably now. So, yeah, please watch that. In the meantime, take care, and I'll speak to you soon.